Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to Prioritizing and Valuing Investments in Resilience. My name is John Kashmar. I'm with the Southeast New England Network. The Southeast New England Network is focused on training and technical assistance for stormwater management. Our vision is to build resilient ecosystems and connect communities through action, collaboration, and innovation. And our mission is empowering communities to achieve healthy watersheds, sustainable finance, and long-term climate resilience through management of stormwater and restoration projects. Our focus area is Southeast New England and Rhode Island, and our website address is snepnetwork.org. I wanted to just mention there will be questions in the webinar. Please feel free to put your questions in the dialog box as we go, and those will be monitored and an opportunity to get to questions. And I'd now like to introduce Joanne Throwe. Joanne joins us from Bristol, Rhode Island. She's a core team member of the network working on innovative finance and leadership development. Joanne is president of Throwe Environmental as well as senior fellow at the University of Maryland School of Public Policy. Joanne's past experience includes serving as deputy secretary for the Maryland Department of Natural Resources and director of the Mid-Atlantic Region's Environmental Finance Center. Joanne currently chairs US EPA's Environmental Finance Advisory Board and is also co-chair of the National Stormwater Finance Task Force for US EPA. We're also very pleased to have the Association of Climate Change Officers co-host this lunchtime webinar along with SNEP. ACCO is the premier professional development organization for individuals addressing climate change in their organization. And we very much look forward to today's conversation. I'd now like to turn it over to Joanne to get us started.
Thanks, John. Well, welcome everyone. And first I want to welcome my partner in crime here, Dan Krieger, Executive Director of ACCO. This is our third webinar, our lunchtime webinar. So Dan, thanks for constantly returning, and we've got some great guests today. But before I introduce our guests, Dan, I am trying hard to build this partnership that I know so well. I know ACCO. You have done such great work nationally. We've talked about it in the past. We've been talking about your town halls and your coffee hours and your superhero focus, but also I want to make sure that we bring elements of ACCO up here to New England. There's so much to offer. And Lindene, Patton, and Sean Carpenter are two guests who are, really important to some of the work that's been developed, particularly the Econ 101 and the work there. And having gone through the academy, Dan, it's just been wonderful experience. So as we move forward, I really do want to bring more as we head to one more week of lunchtime webinars. I want to bring more of ACCO up here and more of what you do and all the people who are part of this. So before we introduce our colleagues here on the call, I want to take a word and just explain a little bit more about some of the projects you're working on and what we hope to do here in the SNEP region.
Thanks, Joanne. Appreciate it. Well, the fundamentals of ACCO are that we're a professional society for those who are looking to drive climate action in their organizations and helping those professionals advance in their stature and their competency to elevate the community of practice. As we've been standing up our training programs, and you're going to get to hear today from Sean Carpenter and Lindene Patton, who played an instrumental role in the shaping of our Economics 101 course module on the economic implications of climate change and thinking about how to evaluate that in the context of decision making. We also we've been contracted by governmental entities like the state of Maryland, when Joanne was the deputy secretary there, to launch the nation's first state-run climate change academy. We've been since contracted by several other states to begin replicating that effort. We're also starting to see more municipal and county governments looking at how to build organization-wide capacity. And so that ranges from things like the climate change version or sustainability version of the cybersecurity training or workplace harassment training that every single employee has to take, to the leadership development and executive training to scenario planning exercises, examining attitudes, behaviors, perceptions, and capacity throughout the organization, which is something we've done a lot of going back to contracts we've had with the U.S. Department of Homeland Security. So we're increasingly doing that to help organizations think about this through the human resources lens, if you will. If you don't have the right people with the right skills in the right parts of your organization and the right governance structure, bringing that all together, you're really going to struggle with any consideration, much less climate change that hits and exacerbates so many different areas of concern and opportunity within organizations. And we're going to talk about that today a little bit, but I hope that during the conversation, Sean, Fort Collins, I think, is really a role model for this amongst local governments. The number of people across the organization who are working on climate change in some way, shape, or form relative to the size of the city and its personnel is off the charts. And so I hope at some point you'll kind of talk about that, because it takes an army working in concert on this, and we can build that army, but it doesn't just happen because we announce something or because we want it to happen. So that's what we do as an organization. And Joanne, thanks for letting me have the opportunity. Sorry, one other note. We had originally planned on bringing our in-person trainings to New England through SNEP in May, and of course COVID has thwarted our plans for world domination. So we are doing those online, and we have new online CCP training, the Certified Climate Change Professional credential, starting in June. But we're looking at ways to create regional context and supplements for people who are participating in the broad. We've got folks from all over the world doing it. And we will definitely, we'd love to have New England communities be participating. We even have a scholarship program for those who don't have funding support. So
yeah,
definitely
having gone through it, there's so much there and so much content, and you're great instructors as well. So we'll be having more information on the SNEP website soon.
Absolutely.
But I'm very
Thank
excited, Dan, that we have this lunchtime conversation. We have Sean Carpenter, who is the Climate Economy Advisor for the City of Fort Collins. You already mentioned him. And Sean is really interesting in that he spent 20 years doing all this emerging response and, post-recovery work overseas. He really has this strong background of venture development, carbon sequestration, agriculture, micro lending. It runs the gamut, and I find it so interesting. I started my career as international development and then transitioned to local. And, Sean has done the same thing here. And now with Fort Collins, who is so lucky to have all his expertise. And we're going to just hear briefly about his position because it's so unique. But I also want to introduce Lindene Patton. Lindene, you may not know this, but we met years ago when you were part of the Environmental Financial Advisory Board, and you were just such a powerhouse, just an amazing mind and your breadth of experience. And I, at that point, I was not a board member yet, and you were just, somebody to watch and listen to.
You're so nice, thank you.
Oh no, I've just, you're just so impressive, and so I'm excited about this conversation. You are a strategic advisor with the Earth and Water Law LLC, and I know that your expertise is unique in the sense that you not only are working on loss litigation strategy, you're doing all this climate work. But you're an attorney who's licensed in California and DC. You have also a Virginia real estate license, right?
Yeah.
And but you also were with the American Board of Industrial Hygienists and retired. So you've run the gamut, and now you're really focused on risk management, and we're very excited to have you here. So both of you have such unique roles, and Dan and I thought it would be best to start and just give us a brief background. Sean, let's start with you and give us just a few words about your role and what you're doing in Fort Collins, and let's start there.
Sure. Thanks, Joanne and Dan, for the introductions. So in Fort Collins, I'm the Climate Economy Advisor, which is a completely bizarre job title. But essentially what it means is we recognize that the economy, both in Colorado and Fort Collins, but nationally and really internationally, we're moving toward a lower carbon future. And so we think that it is to our advantage to help work with, academia. We're fortunate enough to have a major land grant university located here in Fort Collins, Colorado State University, as well as industry partners, to try to position our economy for that lower carbon future that we know is coming, and in some ways it's already here. And because someone will have to create the solutions to the challenges that we face, and if some of those can be created in Colorado and more specifically in Fort Collins, that's relatively beneficial for our community. So there's altruism in the sense that, yeah, we want to try to save the planet, but we're also trying to position our city to relatively benefit from the changes that are coming. And just as a quick example, in Colorado, there are about 3 times more clean energy jobs than there are in oil and natural gas, and this is a big fracking state. So a lot of people are shocked when they hear that, but this transition is already underway. So how do we relatively position Northern Colorado and Fort Collins to benefit? So that's sort of writ large, what my position is and what I'm working on and the high level.
That's terrific. We have a lot of questions to follow up with. But first, Lindene, when I first met you, you were with the Zurich Group and working on the climate change initiative as a senior vice president. So tell me about your work now and tell us a little bit more on what you're working on.
So I have been looking actually at the climate change issues and how that impacts the finance industry for decades, obviously. Looking at it from a portfolio management perspective, different geographic implications, but also looking at it from an operational integration perspective, trying to figure out how at least the insurance industry could begin to consider not just for property policies, but particularly for its casualty business, which are all the liability policies. What is it that climate change could mean as time moves forward? I continue that private practice, which is heavily data-driven now in my law practice. I work largely with insurtech groups, but I do have a specialty, which is sort of my favorite area to look at, which is the emergence of liability in the context of extreme weather events and climate change. So, for example, I'm particularly interested in PG&E's admission that to voluntary manslaughter in California after the Camp Fires. I think that's a game changer. I've also been following the different behaviors, for example, of utilities. Con Ed post Sandy took a very different path in terms of proposing improvements to their infrastructure in response to climate change. And I think that those two companies at this point have sort of represented the spectrum of options. And I think that so far, the response that comes with integrating climate change resilience and sustainable responses into your design and operations is winning out in terms of profitability, as one of those is still a going concern and the other finds itself in bankruptcy again. So they are extreme examples, but that's really particularly what I'm interested in. That's what Sean and I were lucky enough to be able to put together the curriculum for ACCO with Dan on, looking at how is it if you are going to run a municipality, if you're going to run a business, that you can begin to get people thinking about resilience and adaptation. And I think that's sort of the score of our conversation today.
Yeah, so perfect. So Dan, we've been talking about a lot of questions that we want to hit our guests up with today. So you want to go first? You're muted, Dan.
I should have unmuted myself. There we go. Producer error, or user error. There's a range of things that I think we want to cover from this, right? There's the how do we make good investments and how do we inform investments, and there's that on an ongoing basis, and then there's going to be a stimulus coming through where there's going to be dollars going in to create jobs and rebuild economy. So that's a kind of I don't want to say unique because it happened 12 years ago, but it's a crucial moment in time. I think that's one conversation. At some point, I also want to make sure that we get to the credit ratings and the importance that has. But Sean, to my knowledge, you're the only person in the country working in local government who has the lens that you have. And I think that's really interesting. First, how did that even come about? It's one thing to have a community working on climate sustainability. Why was that position created? And you've been in it for a couple of years now. What have you been able to do, and what have you learned along the way from it?
Yeah, no, it's a good question. So maybe I'll take a step back to answer it. Fort Collins in 2005 launched a climate action plan, which a lot of other communities, probably a lot of communities on this call, have done similar work. And toward that end, the city established some pretty aggressive climate action goals, a 20% reduction in carbon footprint over a 2005 baseline by 2020, by the end of this year, which it looks like we're going to meet and slightly exceed, so that's great news. And then the goal starts to hockey stick, 80% reduction in emissions by 2030 and carbon neutral by 2050. So with that community goal in place, I think there was a recognition that we were going to have to, it was going to take more than the city enterprise, that we're going to have to work with the private sector businesses, as well as universities and community colleges, and really it would have to be a community effort to try to rethink how we do things to reach that goal. And we've made the easy goal by 2020, and so now we have essentially 9.5 years to meet a much more difficult goal. And so the challenge is, how do we collaboratively do that in a way that strengthens our economy, protects jobs, and also helps us reach these aggressive climate goals. So talk to me in 9 years. We'll see if I have any hair left.
Well, Lindene, I wanted to ask you, knowing your experience and your sage wisdom, we are going through something, truly unique right now. And we are going to have to rebuild. We're going to have to refocus our efforts after COVID-19. What should we do? What actions can we take that will leave us less vulnerable moving forward? Are there short-term fixes, long-term solutions, things that you've seen that we can help plan for long-term sustainability?
Well, I think consistent with Sean's commentary and other things that we've seen in development, it's going to be essential, one, to assure that we can get trust back from the public. I think people are scared. I think that they're worried about going back to work. I think they're worried about the kinds of sustainable developments that have been promoted by the climate community, which involve urban densification, they involve shared transportation, they involve all of these areas where people now, at least through public opinion pollings, are expressing significant concern. And so I think it's going to be essential, if you want to be able to continue to make progress on the climate agenda, which is, of course, another really critical, security issue, and they do have interrelation. You do have increased pathogen risk in many cases as a consequence of climate change for a wide variety of reasons that are beyond the scope of this call. But what that means is that I believe that people who are in this space more than ever are going to have to be involved in project design and strategy. I think if you're getting involved in community design only in the implementation phase, your options are limited. They're very limited. If you can wheedle your way in to assure that you have networking partners in the transportation area, in the environment, in public health, and critically in the revenue department, find out where the money comes through, whether that's money in a private corporation or whether it's municipal tax revenues. Get a deep understanding about whether your community works and is funded based on shared revenues collected at a state level. Are they, do they get money based on local taxation? Is that taxation real estate based? Is it sales based? Because in most of those cases, once you understand what that base is, then when you begin to do your design, you can arrange the discussion of your benefits in a way that it resonates with the people who control the money, and assure that your designs are responsive in a way so that they not only manage the risk, whether that's an environment risk, a public health risk, but they also do it in a way where the revenues are sustainable. Those, I think, are going to be critical skills going forward. And that's a big ask. That is for a community that is primarily policy-based, not necessarily with a lot of science, but primarily policy-based with support and input from science. That's a big ask to get them to go and cross-connect with the engineers and with the finance guys and girls. So
You're
You know,
here.
when we were putting the Economics 101 module together, one of the things that Sean introduced in was that budget disruption exercise
yeah,
that we
awesome.
developed, the Anytown USA disruption exercise. And there's thinking about that is something that we've seen in the classroom people have really struggled with before they got their hands on the exercise. When they did, it started to change. What are some of the ways, Sean, that you've been looking at the tangible either opportunity flows or disruptions through, whether it's a climate event or you're looking in the realities of, you know, these COVID days?
Yeah, no, I mean, great question. There's a number of strategies that we use, and in particular, when we talk about finance, it's really about how do we take what can be an esoteric concept as climate change feels so big and so diffuse for a lot of people that it's hard for them to get their hands around it. How can we create programs and tools that create those benefit streams, but really focus on things that people resonate with emotionally and that they can identify with? So we might talk a little bit later about the Epic Homes program, which is a project that we've developed to find, finance, and fix 10,000 energy inefficient rental properties and private homes in our community. But not focusing so much on the energy benefits of that, although those are significant, but focusing on the health, well-being, equity issues related to fixing up those houses. And so that's something that everybody can resonate with, and it crosses the political spectrum. And so folks that appreciate it for the carbon savings, they're already on board. But folks that, you know, have kids with asthma and they recognize, wow, that's going to reduce asthma attacks in kids in these houses, that's wonderful. So everybody, I've had bank presidents tell me, this is great. I can remember when I was a young undergraduate and living in a crappy house with 7 guys. I totally get it. I understand what you're doing. And so this is a way that we can take this, some of the challenges, and boil them down to common denominators where everybody can get behind it. That's just one example. Another that maybe if we have a minute to talk about that I know is an opportunity available on the East Coast as well as it is here in Colorado is commercial PACE, or property assessed clean energy finance. And this is an amazing tool to essentially take operating expenses like utility bills and kind of flip them and turn them into capital expenses to upgrade commercial buildings. And so this is growing more than 200% a year in Colorado. And I think it's a really amazing opportunity. And for those states that are on the call, including Rhode Island, Massachusetts, and others that have commercial PACE, this is a perfect example of a public-private partnership that can help, in particular, commercial buildings, which make a fairly large percentage of energy consumption, help make them more energy efficient and more valuable. So tools like that really take these concepts and break them down into something that people can get their heads around, I find to be really helpful.
Yeah. Lindene, so on one of the previous webinars we had, we spoke about Charles County in Maryland and the work they were doing on climate change, on financing and preparedness, and it really influenced their credit ratings. And Dan had mentioned on the intro, we have to save time for discussion about the credit ratings. And so you have recently interacted closely with all the credit agencies, all 3, and I think you maybe ran a panel, but you've worked closely with them, and you know how this is so important. It's important as we recover from COVID-19. But talk a little bit more about what this means.
Sorry, I muted myself. Credit ratings are critical, and because a credit rating dictates how much money costs the community, because you're borrowing that money for a period of time. And in other words, the kinds of projects that Sean has been discussing, the cost of those projects, depending on whether it's pure private finance or there's a municipal component, will fluctuate as a result of whether the criteria that are of interest to the rating agencies are met. And specifically, each of the rating agencies has undertaken over the last couple of years a look into the risks associated with climate change and how climate change might impact the ability of the borrowing entity to repay the bond. And so, for example, if there's a risk of flooding, or there's a risk of some other extreme weather event like a hurricane that exists in the geographical location for a municipality, then the rating agencies have now come to the point where they're trying to understand, well, how much revenue disruption is going to result should one of these events present? And is there anything that the money that's being used in this bonding process, in the money that they're borrowing, that's going to reduce that risk? So in other words, if we let them borrow this money, are they going to just continue to be a better and better risk, or is this borrowing completely unrelated to it? And if it's unrelated to it, what other steps have they taken? And I think this is where Charles County was able to identify, having set their leadership and many of their operational staff through the ACCO training, to at least gain sensitivity to climate risks so that they could begin to internalize the thinking about how to incorporate risk management processes and concepts into their day-to-day work. That is the kind of thing that the rating agencies are looking at. Each of them has their own unique and independent data set that they use to evaluate risk in setting the credit rating. It's pretty clear that none of them is going to give you their black box. It's modeling, much like the modeling that's used by the insurance industry for catastrophic risk expectations for losses for hurricanes. It's the same concept that's being used. It's just a different set of applications. So it is a pretty complex process, but in the end, they're being very transparent that they are looking for knowledge, they're looking for acknowledgement of climate risk, and they're looking for progress. And they've also made it really clear that what satisfies as that progress today will not be the same thing as next year, so that they're going to move the goalpost, and they have been unabashed about it.
Awesome.
You know, and it's not just, you know, you mentioned the ACCO training, and they did specifically cite that in the credit rating affirmation for Charles County. And, you know, Nancy Kopp, who's the state treasurer, stood up at the Board of Public Works meeting in January in front of the governor and cabinet members and on TV and said, you know, look, the next time that Charles County goes to build a school, the taxpayer is going to pay less for that school.
Yes,
because they took this seriously and specifically went and built their own capacity. But within that interview process, Mark Belton, who's the county administrator, also cited the specific projects that they were undertaking that went along with the we're getting serious and training our personnel. One of those projects, Joanne, is one that you've been working on in a 3-county resilience project. They were reacting to, oh, look at 3 counties coming together to tackle this as a group, as opposed to everyone just kind of off doing their own thing. So they're responding to a litany of these things as well, and they're looking for tangible projects. And some of that is they're looking at what are you doing on governance? What are you doing with your people? Some of it is what are you doing on the sorts of projects that Sean is working on in Fort Collins? And how is that translating? And that's a kill 2 birds with 1 stone sort of. That's probably the wrong metaphor in this environment, but let's go with you get 2 benefits to 1 outcome, because those projects, Sean, create jobs. They create economic development, and I think that lens of what you do, especially now, is so important. Is the economic development lens of all of this.
Yeah, that's true. I mean, in the, for example, in the Epic Homes program, that's very labor-intensive work, hands-on work that can't be outsourced. According to ACCO, I believe the number is 17 jobs created for every $1 million invested in the energy efficiency sector and that kind of work, compared to about 10 jobs per million invested in more traditional white collar work. So it is a jobs engine, and certainly having the ability to work with private sector contractors, it does create a lot of support for the program.
Well, and I would say that other communities have experienced that too. So in the Chicagoland community, there's an NGO called Center for Neighborhood Technology. You know, true transparency, I sit on the board, so I know a lot about it. But years ago, they launched something called Rain Ready. And it actually also mitigated climate change related risks, particularly risks of flooding in lower income neighborhoods, and created jobs, because a lot of the solutions weren't just putting in like a backflow protector into the basement. They were rerouting water off the roofs. They were addressing landscape through drainage, you know, all the sort of things that you think about for stormwater runoff management. But it did create local jobs, and that is why it resonated with the community. Not only could they avoid, for every one of those events, the average cost was like $37,000 for the individual homeowner, which for a lower income, you know, family is impossible. If that happens to you every year or every other year, you can't deal with it. But to be able to manage it through local labor skills with advice from experts in the general framing, but being able to implement it, that got people to trust it. It got people local jobs. It solved a problem that they couldn't afford, and they didn't lose their houses anymore. But those are the kinds of, I think, integrated projects that are going to be driving us to the next step. But now you're going to have to look at the area that I think a lot of environmental people have been less comfortable with, and that's public health. And I believe in Colorado, there are a couple of projects in which people began to look at number of excess heat days. Now I'm probably at the limit of my knowledge, but Dan knows a little bit about this, where those projects were focused on trying to figure out in high heat environments where the most vulnerable populations were and where they could protect them. There are analogies here that they were able to leverage existing real estate, existing resources. They were able to be efficient, but solve a public health problem. And I think that's the kind of dynamic thinking that's going to have to exist with this COVID issue too.
Well, so that brings me to a point, Sean. I really want to make sure it comes out today because, and I mentioned in the beginning, you know, I started my career as international development, and I thought the rest of my career I'd be spending overseas. Life had another plan, but I used a lot of that expertise working overseas, and I applied it here. It's, you know, it becomes ingrained in you, but you took the work you did international. I mean, you applied your emergency management training, your, you know, micro lending, and you had so much that you worked on, and in Haiti and in India during, you know, a tsunami and earthquakes and everything else. So how did you work with disasters like that, unanticipated, and then apply to what you're doing in the United States?
Well, no, thanks. Yeah, it's certainly interesting that some of the things that I learned working overseas, as you mentioned, in Haiti and India and other places, I never expected to be applying some of those lessons here in the United States, but here we are. I think the biggest thing I learned is to never waste a crisis, and that a crisis presents an opportunity to reassess, you know, conventional wisdom and assumptions, and really start with a clean piece of paper and say, okay, I know that we've been doing whatever it is for 10, 20, 50, 100 years, but why are we doing that? Can we look at that again? Can we look at everything we're doing and really think about, are there outside the box, and I hate that expression because that is the most inside the box expression, but are there unconventional ways, I hate that expression, to look at what we're doing and maybe do things differently. So I'll give a quick anecdote from India. As you mentioned, I went there right after the Asian tsunami. I think it was 2 days after Christmas 2004, in the very southern tip of India, an area called Patton, and it was completely devastated. The tsunami came inland 5 miles inland and took entire communities, and those are primarily fishing communities. And so a lot of the larger organizations went in with tens or hundreds of millions of dollars, and they were buying new fishing boats for all the fishermen. And we went to communities where the folks there were actually laborers, that they were so poor that they couldn't afford their own boats, and they were laborers on other people's boats. And we looked at this flotsam of thousands of wrecked fishing boats that was all piled up on the shores, and said to those big organizations that were doing response, hey, what are you going to do with all that junk? And they said, oh, you can have it. So we taught these laborers, these fishermen who were laborers on other people's boats, we built a whole program for them to rebuild these abandoned boats. And then those became their boats, and they became their own fishermen and their own boat owners. And you know, we did it for a fraction of what other people were doing their work for. And it was amazing to see people that had been working for other people for sometimes decades, and now they were their own kind of business owners and had their own boats. And you know, the amazing sense of pride that they had, that you know, we took kind of a situation and said, does it have to be built back exactly the way it was before? I don't think so. I think we can do some things differently. And we ended up sort of restructuring and helping the people in those communities kind of restructure their lives because we didn't accept the status quo. And so that's just one example of, you know, taking the opportunity when you have a crisis to really relook at everything and really challenge those assumptions. And I think that's what we're trying to do here in Fort Collins around financial support to small businesses and lending and things like that, because things are going to change after this crisis. And so now's the time to make important systemic and policy changes so that we can build back better.
Yeah, and I think
one of the,
I was just going to say,
go ahead, Lindene.
I was thinking that, you know, the other big weakness, of course, that this COVID-19 event has presented is a further recognition of how unredundant is probably a bad word, right? Our supply chains are, how at risk our supply chains are, from everything from our food supply chains to, you know, computer hardware. Take whatever it is, every one of them. We globalized it without a backup in a lot of cases. And many of the things that the sustainability and resilience community has been pushing is to try to make sure that we have improved local food supply chains, that we have improved local essential goods chains. And I think if you're looking at investment again in this space, don't lose sight of that improving your supply chain with at least a minimum local essential capacity, for example, for food, would also create jobs and might take up some otherwise unused real estate that is quite unattractive for the purposes of, let's say, office buildings, but might be absolutely fabulous for an urban farm. And I think that those have been, while they've been adopted in some cases, they've been the concept of urban farming has been highly resisted in other cases. And I think people should take a run at it again as a mechanism for, you know, taking multiple things on the box: jobs, local food security, local taxes and revenue. I mean, I'm sure someone who's smarter than me and could like run through an individual project would come through with a multitude of those things. But again, that type of thinking, if articulated back to a rating agency, would enable you to get, you know, a nice credit rating and a good bond value if you needed money to really start it. And the other point to be made is if you can improve the food security supply chain, especially in underserved areas, you're also going to get at some of the comorbidity issues which really have negatively impacted poorer communities in this COVID-19 event.
So, you know, there's the underlying gorilla in the room here, elephant in the room, is the inequities that this is causing. And earlier we were talking about the importance of protecting revenue flow. Mm-hmm. And that in and of itself creates a potential for the furtherance of those inequities. There's this we need to make sure that we protect our real estate or our businesses that drive the largest volume of sales tax. And that immediately creates the, oh, okay, we're going to make those investments into areas that have a predisposition of being more resilient already. And so the co-benefits part is really important here. But you're talking things like there's housing in all over the country that is classified as substandard because it's not energy efficient or properly insulated. And so that being able to correlate these investments that protect revenue, but that also address these health inequities that help that create jobs at the same time. We've got to do all of those things, because if you only go where the greatest financial protections are, that overlooks the inequities.
Well,
Sean,
I think that's such an important point, but this is part of why when Sean and I and you have been teaching Economics 101, we've been relentless about saying, don't just look at the revenue side of the equation, look at the expense side of the equation. And that's capital expense and variable expense. And in the public health context, that is capital expense and variable expense. And right now, COVID-19 is killing us with variable expense, so to speak. So I would say that that is really important to keep that in mind. And my experience so far in consulting with, I'll just say, certain levels of government about perhaps evaluating revenue impacts in these contexts. When I brought up the expense side, all the revenue people said, oh, wow, okay, we know, but can we just start with the revenue side, because the expense side is so complicated. And I said, sure, start with anything, it's better than nothing, but keep in mind that just because you keep your revenue, kind of really to resonate with Dan's point, doesn't mean that you've solved your problem. In fact, you could move a horrible variable expense, load into another part of your community that you just by focusing only on particular kinds of revenue. Because the revenue, you get sales tax revenue, you get jobs and income revenue, if you just created local jobs. So.
Well, Dan, I have a question I want to hit Sean up with. So a couple of years ago, Sean, so you had the Mayor Bloomberg Challenge. And so Fort Collins got some big award. I'd love you to talk about it because it relates to this conversation, and just talk about that challenge, what it meant for Fort Collins and what you did with the money.
Sure. So that was the 2018 Bloomberg Philanthropies Mayor's Challenge. Mayor Bloomberg has, for over a decade, has invested in cities around the world and in the United States and Latin America and elsewhere. And his sort of premise is that, and these are sort of Bloomberg statistics, and can't verify the accuracy, but that 98% of global GDP is produced in cities and only 2% in rural areas. Now, I don't know if that's accurate or not, but even if it's close, it really sharpens the focus that cities are where a lot of important things are happening. And so their philanthropic efforts are really focused on how do we help cities who in many ways don't get involved in politics as much. They're very much interested in, they're much closer to their constituents, and they're much more interested in really doing practical work. And so that's sort of the emphasis of Bloomberg Philanthropies. So for that end, they actually, the first Mayor's Challenge in 2016, I think, was won by Providence, Rhode Island. So they may be on the call. They did an amazing program called Providence Talks, and they were really inspirational to us when we were entering this competition. So anyway, we entered this competition, 320 cities entered, and they went through various phases, and we ended up winning, being selected as one of 7 grand champion cities. We won $1 million, about $1.2 million from Bloomberg Philanthropies, and we used it for the EPIC program that I mentioned earlier to find, finance, and fix energy and efficient rental properties and single family homes, but really focusing on closing the equity gap. There's a lot of, in our community, over 50% of residents are renters, and that makes sense. The housing is fairly expensive here, and if you're a low moderate income household, it's very difficult to buy a home here. So 96% of our LMI households are renters. So how do we create a program that can have them get some of the benefits of addressing climate change and other welfare benefits, even though they might not own the asset. So we built an on-bill finance program. We're fortunate enough to own our own municipal utility here, and we have all our own utilities apart from natural gas. So that was a big lever that we could pull. So we took a pilot on-bill finance program and we sought external capital. So we raised money from private banks and used the Bloomberg prize money to seed the on-bill finance program. And I just closed a second round of financing last week with a national bank based in Denver. And we also borrowed some money from the state, and we closed about $3.25 million in financing last week. So we have about $8 million right now. And we hope soon that as soon as folks can start working in homes again, and right now we're not allowing any of the contractors in our program to go into people's houses for obvious reasons, but unoccupied houses they can work on, and we hope soon to see the ability to really get hundreds of projects in the pipeline. And what we're doing is these loans are very low interest, and because we are able to leverage the credit rating of the city and the credit worthiness of the city to borrow at low cost and pass those savings on to our customers. So borrowers can borrow up to 15 years at very low interest, no money down, and they can upgrade these old, inefficient, in particular rental properties. And the owner repays that bill on their portion of the utility bill. So they have to have a service in their name. Here in Fort Collins, most people keep water in their name. Because water damage, things like that is a big issue for rental property owners. So they get alerts if there's unusual water activity and things like that. They want to make sure the tenants are watering the grass. So most landlords keep the water in their name anyway. So that works out really well, and we sell it to landlords that, look, you have to stay competitive. There's a lot of new construction. You have to upgrade these crappy old properties, and it'll be good for your business. It'll be good for your tenants. Your tenants can enjoy greater comfort, health, and well-being. They're going to stay in your property longer, and that reduced turnover is going to save you money. And so, in part of this project is to collaborate with Colorado State University. We're doing an indoor environmental quality study in parallel with this program to measure the improvements in indoor air quality and health and well-being for folks living in these houses that have been fixed up. We hope to demonstrate and build a data set that shows that this is a good investment. And in fact, we'd like to get to the point where it can almost be a prescription, where the medical community could say, you know what, this house needs to have a $12,000, $15,000 Epic home upgrade, and then get insurance even to pay for it. So I mean, that could be 5 years down the road, but we see that if we create the data that shows this is making people's lives better and improving health and well-being, then this will sell itself. And lastly, I would say we've all been cooped up in our houses for months. And so if you weren't aware of deficiencies in your home before, you are now. And so we think there's going to be a lot of people ready to spend some money to upgrade their properties and their rental properties once this is over. So maybe I'll stop there.
Oh, Joanne, you're muted.
Oops, yes, I was. So Sean, I thought that was such a great story, and look what you did with $1 million. It's amazing. I want to, with the time we have left, I want to ask people who are on this call to please send in your questions. I've got it in front of me, and we're happy to give some questions to our guests here. But I want to continue the conversation. Lindene, go ahead.
Yeah, I had two things that I wanted to bring up that are really coming, at least across my desk, with some frequency now. One has to do with transportation systems. I've been getting a lot of inquiries about transportation systems, going back to work, and debt and the related indebtedness that those transportation systems in suburban and rural environments have incurred during this process, and then the trust issue. So a lot of the dialogue that's happening in the insurance industry with respect to COVID-19 and resilience and liability has been drawing parallels to terrorism. Now they're very different in some ways and very much the same in other ways, because people are afraid, and they want assurance before they go back that they can run their businesses and go back to their lives with mitigated risk. When the issues associated with terrorism presented after World Trade Center, people said, oh, we're never going back in the city. We're not going to do it. I just don't trust it. And what you found is that people, as processes were put in place to manage buildings and transportation systems, security issues were addressed, that people did begin to trust again and were willing to go back to work. And I think we're going to see that same kind of process, but the tools are going to be different. And when we started this for terrorism, everybody said, oh my gosh, it's going to cost so much, we can't possibly do this. And of course, the more volume of those protective systems that were purchased, the less expensive they got, and they just became integrated into the process. So if you think about how you deal with like clean rooms, for example, everyone today would say, well, gosh, if we have to treat public spaces like we treat clean rooms, we can't afford that. I think that there are some technologies that people are talking about, though, which sort of do make sense. Just like you walk through a security screening station to have and put your luggage through some little thing so it x-rays. What if it, they put a UV light over the top of it or something that was a proven, and I'm not sure what's proven and what's not, but a proven technology to at least reduce viral load or reduce bacterial contamination, the kinds that are used now in sort of health environments. I think those are some of the things that when people are thinking about how are they going to make a project be a winner and get engagement to improve resilience for other types of things, those types of issues need to be considered and integrated because you've got to get those transportation systems back up. The other issue that I think hasn't been addressed yet is there's been a lot of talk about using insurance to stabilize business income interruption. But there's been next to no discussion other than a few surveys that have been done about the level of concern that business operators have for reopening their doors, especially small businesses, in terms of liability exposure. What if somebody claimed, that they got COVID coming into their business? And many of the businesses I'm hearing from now are quite concerned about that, legitimately, because although people have discussed the exclusions on the property policies for business interruption, very few people have discussed the fact that there are virus, pollutant, and bacterial exclusions, communicable disease exclusions on all of the casualty general liability policies too. My guess is that you'll see some innovation in that space, but it's going to take a little bit there. But I think that that's another thing that to collaborate on with the insurance industry again to try to see if they can get some change.
Great points, thank you. So I don't have any questions from the team. They're just listening to this conversation. Can we continue? Dan, you have a question? Otherwise, I have many.
Yeah, well, so what I'm curious about, Lindene, is a while back, we were talking about the insurance a little while ago, and I just realized that there was a lawsuit some years ago where some of the insurance companies went after, I think, was it the city of Chicago, for failing to have addressed climate impacts on infrastructure. And it dawns on me, this isn't just a credit rating issue. There's an insurance component of this. That was the kind of the shot that was fired across the bow. And Lindy and I, basically, you were the chief climate officer at Zurich. Do you have a sense as to what these sorts of efforts are going to mean in the context of insurability going forward?
Yeah, it's a really good question because the insurance industry has focused historically on mitigating risk to property, especially high risk, high value properties. And recently with climate change risk, there have been attempts to try to insert requirements for insurability related to climate change risk. So for example, if you're at the WUI, there are certain circumstances in which there have been attempts by the insurance industry to reduce coverage or change pricing to reflect the increased risk, but to give credits for things that perhaps would reduce risk, like removing oil-based plants from around your property. Unfortunately, the science hasn't necessarily always backed up the basis or criteria on which they would like to increase or reduce pricing. And so I think this is another area when it comes to public health where if the liability is going to be assumed under the policy, those risks are going to have to be considered. But in the particular case that you're talking about, the 9 ring counties surrounding Chicago, in which there was litigation filed against the wastewater treatment facilities for repeated backflow problems, where basically the sewage, instead of going out, was coming back into the basements of people's houses as a result of capacity limitations and infrastructure maintenance failures. I think that was a shot across the bow from the industry. I can't say a lot about that piece of litigation, but if it had gone through, it may have had a lot of characteristics of some other environmental litigation where there would have been a lot of cross claims, multiple properties involved, extraordinarily expensive litigation. I think the goal was to try to avoid the circumstances that were manifesting in the industry for some, which was shown up by the data, where the backflow was occurring once, twice a year, at the minimum every other year for a lot of these repeat properties. And under the code, an insurer, third time you're out, right? So they don't have to renew the insurance, which creates an incredible instability inside the local community, because now the property's not insured, right? And you have somebody of low to moderate income means who may have a $25,000, $35,000 bill from a flood in their basement, which can destroy the foundation. I mean, not to mention the public health issues that come up from backed up sewage. And with utilities, they're often sovereigns, and so they aren't liable for these type of impacts, or they might have minimum liability for it. So depends on the locality. So I think there is a possibility of some sort of mass tort litigation, but society just hasn't gotten there yet. People are too busy worrying about whether they have a job and how they're going to get their communities back. Generally, when that kind of dust settles, then people start looking for who might have more money than they do. So.
We're starting to get to a point where there's enough knowledge out there, and I think there's a correlation here as you start to get to like the Flint, Michigans, where there is well more than enough data, well more than enough public discourse that if you're leading local government or utility infrastructure programs and you've been ignoring these risks, where do you think that's? I think people are going to be on the hook for this. Do you have that sense, and or at least at risk of facing tribunals, if you will, for having failed to address these risks?
Oh, I think that depending again on the state of the science and the state of the community knowledge, yeah, I think people are tired of failure to address risk, failure to take action. And when that results in bodily injury or property damage to constituents who they thought were supposed to be protected by those services and by those representatives, there's little humor left in the public for that. And so I think, especially when it's quasi-public or a monopolistic entity that might not be sovereign, sovereigns are technically immune from liability except where they allow it. And in most cases where that sovereign can be shown to have caused bodily injury or property damage, where there wasn't a balancing issue, where it was arbitrary or whether they chose to ignore, in most circumstances, there are statutory ways to go after those sovereigns. And I think that's what you're seeing. And that's what that's what you saw with public utilities. That's what you see with some of these sovereigns and communities. So I guess if people aren't able to proactively invest in resilience, you might see more of that as the driver.
Okay, we are just about out of time. Sean, Lindene, thank you so much for being with Dan and I today. Great lunchtime conversation. And we will be back, Dan. I hope you're coming back for one more time. We've got next week, May 8th from 12 to 1, another lunchtime conversation. And we're going to be talking about managing shifts in community resilience priorities in light of COVID-19. And we have a wonderful guest, Chris Castro from Orlando will be joining us. And we had somebody who at the last minute last week was not able to join us, Nancy Smith, and coming from the Boston perspective, the public health perspective, and she'll be with us next Friday. So Dan, you'll be back, right? Yes?
As long as my computer doesn't crash again. I don't know if you noticed, but I disappeared about 15
something
minutes
there.
ago. We pulled the second laptop out and we were doing the adjustments on the fly. This seems to be a regular occurrence these days.
No, it was great. It was so wonderful spending this hour with you. Sean, hope to see you, and Lindene, you too. Keep up the great work you're doing. And Dan, I'll see you next week. Bye, everybody.
Thank you all for joining. Appreciate it.
Bye. Thanks, everybody.